insightful panel. Accompanying him is Dr. Samir V. Kamat, Secretary, Department of Defense Research and Development, who with his extensive experience and strategic vision will undoubtedly co-guide us through the exploration of lessons learned from innovation success stories. Now let's warmly invite our esteemed panelists who bring a wealth of experience and insights to the table. First, Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi, Director General, Research and Information System for Developing Countries. With his extensive expertise and profound insights, we anticipate Dr. Chaturvedi's valuable contributions to enriching our discourse. Next, Shri Nilaya Verma, the Chief Executive Officer of Primus Partners India Limited. He joins us with his expertise in translating success stories into business strategies. Mr. Sanjeev Bikhchandani, founder and vice chairman of InfoEdge, which owns Naukri.com, will share his insights in the IT sector and how innovation success stories can be replicated. Finally, Shri Pramath Sinha, the chairperson of the Board of Trustees at Ashoka University, will provide valuable perspectives on replicating success stories in the educational landscape. Together, let's unravel the narratives of success and discover the key lessons that can be applied across sectors. I would now hand over the proceedings to Dr. Virmani and Dr. Kamat to steer us through this enlightening discussion.
Thank you. I guess the way we'll do it is that I'll kind of give the, I presume it's loaded on the there, and then I'll kind of hand it over to you to conduct the things. I may intervene a bit during the thing, but that should be okay. So let me just start. I think we are running a bit late, right? So we should start immediately. So. I think it's come. No, I'll do this. It's here now? Oh, slide changer is where? I can use this, that's fine. I don't see it.
Slide changer. We can use this as well.
Oh, okay. Anyway, so let me start, after a long time, I visited, last week I visited VSSC and had the opportunity, opportunity to meet with I think there were 30 top scientists, so it was a great pleasure. As there are no introductions, let me introduce myself to give you the perspective from which I'm coming. I studied physics and engineering, so I have a deep interest in science. But of course, what I'm going to do today is to give you an economist's perspective. So let's just start, given that we have... So, one of the things for us which distinguishes science from technology is something we call uncertainty versus risk. And uncertainty, the difference is that risk has a profile, a known profile. So you can have a broader risk profile or a smaller one. Those who've done probability and use it know what that means. Uncertainty means it's undefined. So that's one simple way in which I distinguish between science and technology. Technology has to be based on risk assessment and expected benefits and costs. So I will only be talking about technology today. So one of the, sorry, did somebody say something? No. I think the setting up of the National Science Foundation is a very important development, because one of the problems, and I'll mention the context towards the end, which I have in my talks with various people come across, is this difficulty for bureaucrats and generalists to estimate the risk. So that's why I mentioned the risk to start with. And I'll give you an example of that later. And so it's very important that there be specialized experts who do make these judgments. because it's all a matter of judgment, because, and you have a spectrum from uncertainty to high risk to medium risk to low risk. There are very few low risk projects. I mean, government actually need not get into those. If they are low risk, the private sector takes care of it. So that is one thing. The second, I'll talk very briefly about the difference between commercial and strategic technology and the role of government, departmental enterprises and the private sector. Again, I think this economic perspective is very new. It's, as I understand it, the PM is very keen on bringing the private sector, so it's useful to be clear about what is it and why is it and where is it that each one has a role. And finally, I will talk a little bit about the dimensions of risk and some of the gaps in innovation ecosystem or weaknesses which I've kind of, in my very brief investigations, found. So this is just the perspective. I'm sure there'll be a lot of expert and discussions we'll have now, you probably had earlier and have more later. So the fundamental difference between commercial and strategic technology is that the former is connected with the general technological level of the country. It depends on the whole industrial structure, while strategic technology is very much driven by governments. We've all heard of DARPA, etc., but this is true all over the world, and it's true in history. So that is the basic difference. Commercial technology development is driven by the profit motive. Strategic has to be driven by the strategic, and that's what's happened in history. But of course, private decisions are affected by the government's macro policy. So that's where government, if it wants, can intervene. I just want to mention, I presume that this is some interaction with states, so I want to mention that states have an important role in supporting innovation. And the motivation should be because exporting firms are more productive and invest more in R&D. They also train and employ more skilled people. So this is research comparing exporting firms and domestic firms in the same area. And this is the result they find, that the exporting firms are more productive in these areas. So you generate more high-skilled employment in the state in which you promote innovation and R&D. And of course, I already mentioned strategic defense technology, but there is an economic concept here which is very important, which some of the people who advised on the procurement policy were not aware of, and that's why I want to mention it. Defense is basically what we call a monopsony. The word monopoly means a single producer. Monopsony means a single buyer. This has important implications for a lot of things, So when we talk about producing submarines or something, there's one buyer, okay? And that makes a lot of difference from the usual competitive commercial type of stuff. So it's important to keep that in mind. Obviously, technologists are not going to be using that, but then you have to consult an economist to know something, not a bureaucrat who knows nothing about it. That's the point only. And of course, dual-use technology is a little more complicated. Even the US is having great difficulty in defining the line between commercial and strategic, which is going on with semiconductors, etc. But again, my purpose in mentioning is not to give a whole lecture, but just to say that these are important things which have to be kept in mind when we make policies and act on these things. So very quickly, the role of government. Why the R&D and innovation has an important role for government? Because this is an area where there is the largest gap between social returns and private returns. So there are returns which dissipate in the society and contribute to the whole society and cannot be appropriated by the person who does the R&D and develops the product. So that is the gap. This happens in highways, for example. It's in many other things. But the biggest gap is in R&D. So that is why there is an important role for government, that it has to fill that gap if it wants. If it doesn't do it, then there'll be less R&D, there'll be less innovation in the whole country. So closing the social-private gap is one. And the second element is reducing risk. Risk means higher the risk, the more capital you use, etc. I'll say a little bit more about that later, but reducing risk is another. And of course, there are many methods, subsidies, tax incentives, etc. I'll come back to it a little bit, just to give you an idea. So role of private sector. So commercial, I already mentioned clearly, largely competitive creation and technology supply, okay? So they are efficient, they do these things generally. I'm talking about the world. We can come back to the weaknesses of India. The second one is kind of incomplete. That thing should actually read, it's monopoly, conventional monopoly, or based on IPR protection. So this is a kind of alert or warning, something again I've learned in the last year or so, that monopolies, whether they are due to being a single producer or some IPR which nobody else has, some of these companies may actually, and they are foreign companies, we don't have any in India actually, who have this kind of capability, that they may actually say, okay, we will buy your technology and then just kill it, okay? So it may be in their commercial interest to just kill the technology. Now, as a country, we do not want that. We do not want any technology which we are making to go into the hands of such companies who have an interest. It's not ideological, it's commercial. Their commercial interest dictates that they just kill it because they'll destroy all the existing business. So there's something to be aware of. The cases which I've heard basically are in vaccines and biological, actual cases. I don't want to talk about those, but this is based on, so that is just a thing to be aware of. Now, you know, I mentioned dual use and strategic, and the whole debate actually is going on in the US right now, but the important thing here is that in dual use technology, you can unbundle it and introduce what we call benchmark competition. Sometimes it's very difficult to have competition in really strategic sectors, but in dual use, you can do that. That's kind of the characteristic again from a policy perspective, and I think some of you have actual experience where you are distributing and licensing it to private sector, so you would understand. And maybe, you know, if it's relevant to your address, you may take that up. What about role of DPDs? You know, DRDO, I will put that as DPD, but it's not exactly, it's on the border. But the advantage is that you know, you can attract risk-averse, high-quality, social-minded researchers. So in many areas, including DRD, other places, I've met so many motivated, highly motivated. They are not driven by profit. They are not driven by wages, but by something inside them. So the public sector, in a way, provides a home for that, you know. And then given government can think long-term, it is what we call has a low discount rate or a larger horizon than any company or private, so, and low borrowing rate. So if it's very capital intensive investment or long duration, the government is better able to do it. And of course, government has low or zero default risk. But the disadvantages, I think, is very important to also be aware of. Bureaucratic constraints, parliamentary accountability, again, all those of you who have dealt with it know it. And this is perhaps you don't think of the narrow product focus. You see, a commercial company is always looking at different ways of using whatever they invent. That, as far as I have come across, is absent in public. You just focus generally on, okay, we have been tasked to do this, or we decided to do this, and you just focus narrowly. That's a general thing. I'm not saying everybody at all time does it, but that is the danger. Okay, a couple of slides more. One, I think it's, I've talked a little bit about it, but again, this relates to the previous one. There are really three dimensions of innovation. One is capital intensity. So, capital intensity, so that we have, let's say, the interest rate which is government pays or government companies pays versus private companies versus SMEs, it goes on increasing. So which means they pay a higher cost of capital. Government pays less. So government is more able to do highly capital intensive projects where you have to bring together a lot of equipment, etc. Skill intensity has the opposite effect generally, which we see across the world, which is that highly skilled, flexible startups are good for that kind of stuff because they have that flexibility. They don't have that bureaucratic. And you will hear of many cases where, you know, large companies, whether they are drug companies, Microsoft, etc., buy these small companies when they develop something. So that development phase is really very important to involve a lot of small companies if it's not very capital intensive, if it's skill intensive. And finally, the degree of risk. Again, obviously, government is more able to take high risk, high duration, and the SMEs much less. So overall, this is obvious, but let me repeat, the large public sector companies are probably should focus on highly capital intensive, long duration, risky projects, and intermediate, the large private firms, and of course small ones and startups in this restricted area. And of course you can unbundle and divide that up. And again, I'm very glad to hear that many people, including DRDO, are doing this already, which is good. But that's kind of the economics behind it. Last two slides, lab to market. So here is some of my learnings, and I hope to learn a little more from all of you. Is that I found that they are, we don't think finely enough that they are separate stages of risk. So proof of concept, prototypes, you go through 1, 2, 3. It's not just one prototype. You know, where I've talked to private firms who are doing innovation, this is the thing comes up. Or even professors in IITs, etc. This is, you know, the government generally thinks of it as a unit, but there are many stages, and each requires its own kind of intervention or ecosystem. So different stages of prototype. At some point, whether you have to determine, okay, it's all prototype is ready, but is it a producible product in a factory? Okay, it's not just lab anymore, prototype. How producible it is, and of course, finally, how marketable it is. And each of these stages, I've discovered that some of the links have been built up, but some are still missing. Okay, so some places the government funding, angel investors, venture capital are filling, but there are still gaps left in some of these areas. The risk appetite and ability of domestic companies is one, and this is the danger I told you about, that you know, foreign companies, I find that many complaints I heard that they just don't get domestic companies, and this danger always remains that a foreign company will just buy it up and do nothing. The other aspect, which again I've heard complaints, is government procurement rules. So for example, if a small private individual or company develops a scanner, let's say for airports, all airport procurement is government, effectively. But their rules don't permit it, okay? So it's very important where government is a major or sole buyer to look at all these procurement rules. Again, somebody like me doesn't know all these rules, but I'm open. This is one of the things I ask every visitor who comes to my office, that please tell me, where are these problems? Because this is something we can solve easily. You know, there's it's useless to keep having these things where we ourselves restrict purchase of developed technology. And then sustained IPR help, again, it's happening, but the way our systems is that government funds for 3 years, then you say, okay, you are now on your own. So whether that help to IPR will sustain or not is still a question mark in my mind. So you must have sustainable systems. You know, given 1.4 billion people, there'll be a lot of people who just do not have the funds to even have an IPR, which will then be picked up by somebody else. And then, of course, the rules on taxation. And one of the important things I find here is the bias against startups. Unfortunately, this goes is very deep. I won't talk about it, but I'll put it down. So here are a couple of ideas which I'll just lay on the table. Maybe people will not be addressing it today, but maybe later. Or anybody has ideas, I'm always open to it. One is the concept of a strategic technology commission, which actually professor, I forget his name, professor of IIT Madras, who wrote a report in 2009, which started as, by the way, an analysis of DRDO, but his report was much broader. So he recommended the setting up a strategic technology commission, which had covered all non-AEC, non-ISRO technology. In the last Finance Commission, I wrote a note for the Finance Commission where I recommended that this commission have a non-lapsable pool of funds with some kind of a 5-year rolling allocation. and some of this has been done in some way since then. Flexibility is very important. I mentioned high risk and uncertainty. Because things are so uncertain, you need to shift funds away for things which are proceeding slowly and to things which are proceeding quickly. So there has to be somebody who has the knowledge and the trust to be able to do it. Otherwise, you have procedures which take years. It's too slow for technology development. You know, instead of developing in 5 years, you'll develop in 10. And some kind of flexibility. And finally, incentives, I mentioned, these are on the table, but again, we used to have something called a double deduction for R&D expense. At some point, it was abolished. There are new ideas which have come up. One I heard yesterday, which is about matching government grants to R&D expenditures of companies, because I think we do need to somehow incentivize greater R&D in the private sector. And another idea which comes from Israel, which I call it simply convertible equity. Normally we have something called convertible debentures or debt. This is the opposite of that. That is, government takes a share, and if it succeeds, they can convert it into debt. So it's not that you're forcing your partnership on them, but you're just making sure the incentives are right. That is, if there is a loss, you will take it as an equity holder. And if there's a gain, you don't get huge gains, but you make sure you get the funds back and can reuse it for other equity. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry I took longer than I intended, but unfortunately, being an quasi-academic, this is a problem I always have. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Virmani. Since we are behind schedule, I will skip my intervention and I'll request the distinguished panelists also to keep their talks to less than 8 minutes if possible. Shri Pramath Sinha has a hard stop at 4 p.m. so I'll request him to go first.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kamat, for accommodating me, and I apologize in advance to my fellow panelists and the audience here that I may have to step away at 4 o'clock. I'm looking at this from the point of view of how to unleash innovation in states. And I don't want to speak on this topic without relying on some of my experience. So I will just speak to some of the experience that I've had and what I have seen happen. I've seen many attempts to unleash innovation, but I think the two places where I've seen it actually happen during my career are one in Malaysia, where I got the chance as a consultant to work with the government on making the shift from a manufacturing economy to a knowledge economy. And this was way back in 1995, which was a program initiated by the then Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, who became Prime Minister later again. And then carrying over that experience to the work that I was again very involved in as a consultant with the government of Andhra Pradesh when Chandrababu Naidu was the Chief Minister. And to the extent that you could give credit to both that country, even though it's a country, it's a bit of the size of an Indian state, and Andhra Pradesh, I thought I would just dwell on my few learnings from these two instances. In both cases, the mandate was to bring about more innovation to the state and to take the state from whatever state of development it was to a whole new level, to change the source of economic development from manufacturing and agriculture to higher order knowledge industries, to be a source of new ideas, new innovation. And one of the things that I learned, and obviously is also my bias because as some of you know, I'm very involved in higher education, was that innovation doesn't happen by itself and by just creating the hardware, but you really need software. And the software in this case is the importance of human capital. It's absolutely critical to have people who will innovate. You can't just build a factory of innovation. So to give you a very stark example, when we were working in Malaysia, we found that it was very easy to say that you could transform yourself into a knowledge economy, and Mahathir, Prime Minister at that time, was very taken by what was happening in Bangalore in India. But one of the things we realized was that they were so focused on manufacturing in the previous decades, through the 80s and 90s, that their entire education system was built around mechanical engineers and electrical engineers and the hardcore engineering disciplines. So much so that there was very little computer science education or innovation in or education in innovative ideas or innovative thinking that was happening, because their whole education system had been aligned towards manufacturing. And so one of the big things that they did in those days was to declare 4 or 5 big innovation mission mode type projects. And now my memory is a bit hazy, but one of the things that they focused on was on smart government. For example, you see examples of that with the whole national payment systems that have taken over in India, and the digitization that has happened, and the work that has happened around Aadhaar and so on, which has brought in a lot of innovation. I'm actually a person who trained in computer vision many years ago, and when I walk into a DigiYatra terminal at the airport, for me it is magic, because I remember spending a whole summer writing a program on how the edge of a face has to be determined relative to the background in the camera, and now you can just walk in having uploaded your photograph and your boarding pass, which is an innovation that you don't see anywhere in the world today. So by declaring these mission mode projects in Malaysia, and to some extent we've done that at the national level in India, I think that forces innovation. And they had a project on smart government, they had a project on smart cards, they had a project on smart banking, they had a project on smart transportation and so on at that time. Smart was a flavor of the month in those days, a flavor of the year in those days. So today it doesn't mean very much. So I think one was that. The other was really to set up the software infrastructure in terms of talent. So in Malaysia, we built something called Multimedia University. In those days, digital was not such a well-known word. Everybody was fascinated by multimedia technologies. So we called it Multimedia University. And actually, there is an MMU outside Kuala Lumpur in an area called Cyberjaya, which has 8,000 students, which I was very involved in setting up in those days, which created software engineers that then went on to join the IT revolution that happened in Malaysia. Now, it's another story why Malaysia did not get credited with a lot of the innovations that happen in IT, and there are some political reasons for that, those who followed the history of that country and what happened in the Asian crisis. But that's just another example of how, very quickly, and then I'll stop given the interest of time, I have personally seen how the setting up of the Indian School of Business, ISB, which I was associated with, in the Gachibowli area, around the outskirts of Hyderabad, completely transformed that area. And I remember that the Chief Minister had a vision in those days. In 1997, I remember seeing a presentation by him where he said, I'm going to make Hyderabad the knowledge hub of Asia. Now, it may not be that Hyderabad became the knowledge hub of Asia, but if you go there today, Gachibowli looks like any high-tech city or very advanced society in the world. And the Microsoft Research Center, which is a hub of innovation for Microsoft around the world, and the largest center for Microsoft outside of Seattle, actually came up right next to ISB because we were there. And many ISB management graduates work there. Many IIT and technology engineers work there. There is IIIT Hyderabad, which is right next door, which was a public-private partnership also in education and is one of the top technology institutions in the country. And so not to overemphasize the point, and many others will be talking about it, I think I just wanted to leave you with these 2 points, that I think the picking up of projects that require innovation in a mission mode, coupled with, of course, all of the things that Dr. Virmani talked about in terms of government policy, funding, procurement, support, political support, government support, coupled with very high quality education that encourages young people to think, to innovate, to give them the space to come up with ideas, I have found have contributed a lot to the development of innovation in states, and I hope those ideas are helpful to some of you who come from states. I come from Bihar, and I have always lamented the fact that in fact some of these things have never been implemented in my state. In fact, there is very little focus on either focusing on such projects or indeed, unfortunately, on education, and most of us from that state have to go outside to get the kind of education you need to be able to innovate. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for accommodating me, sir.
Thank you, Shri. So I'll now request Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi to give his views.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Dr. Kamat. Thanks, Dr. Virmani, for your very interesting address. Thanks, Dr. Saraswat, for getting all of us together on this very important issue of how we bring in innovation at the level of states, and how do we bring in better performance and motivation. Apart from being head of a research institution here in Delhi, I have been involved in Madhya Pradesh Rajya NITI Aayog as its vice chairman, and had an opportunity of bringing together various actors who are important for state innovation system, and particularly for states which are trying to bring in transformation more from the point of view of transition from agriculture to manufacturing and bringing in services. So a state of Madhya Pradesh, which has exhibited 19.6% of economic growth in last 4 quarters, with huge jump in GSDP, with the target of 550 billion. The idea of innovation system is a very natural fallback system. NITI Aayog has this beautiful system of assigning members to different states, and Madhya Pradesh is so fortunate to have none other than Dr. Saraswat responsible for Madhya Pradesh. And this gave us bandwidth in terms of how middle-level states can transform their innovation system. There are 5 points that I want to make, and I think it is important for states to focus as they think of innovation. First and foremost, of course, is the idea of capacity to bring in research, innovation, technology absorption. So how do we create adequate human resources? And Mr. Sinha, you were absolutely right when you pointed out for Bihar in terms of educational limitations. I think for states, the first and foremost is to bring in skills that are needed. And for that, Madhya Pradesh initiated 4 years back the Global Skill Park, and this has given an impetus in terms of how we have trained manpower. As we see this going forward, the second important dimension, apart from skills, where states should focus, and there more NITI Aayog, central NITI Aayog led programs are needed in terms of how do we do that at the sectoral level. And that's when I come to second point in terms of connecting the various sectoral interventions that are needed by state governments and led by the central government. Prime Minister's idea of providing a new structure to R&D entities within the country so that innovation reaches out to states at this point is absolutely important. Dr. Vijay Raghavan as a principal scientific advisor recalibrated the scheme in terms of facilitating coming up of clusters at the state level. He tried that in Pune, he tried that in Hyderabad, but more of the states which are under transition from agriculture to manufacturing, they require more of that innovation system come in. And that's where role of NITI is extremely important to envisage that future which states are targeting at with as high as GSDP of 550 and UP has come up with the 1 trillion. So I think the second important dimension is putting that vision on a action track mode where that intervention is extremely important. Associated with that is the point that Prime Minister again asked the states to identify one district, one product. What is it that we need in terms of technological sophistication? How do we all take advantage of the initial institutional frameworks that have come up at various levels, like for instance in the initial years of our independence, the southern states got many academic and scientific institutions. Mysore has the National Institute for Food Technology. Now, if we see one district, one product, 26 products out of 52 products in a state like Madhya Pradesh are from food sector. You require sophisticated technologies. You require technologies that can bring in shelf life value for those products. These are not great R&D that we need. Dr. Virmani was referring to defense innovation. Those of us who are studying innovation know pretty well how the military industrial complexes came up and Pentagon really provided the fillip that was needed. So from that point of view, I think we need to bring in even DRDO-led technologies may also bring in innovation for packaging technologies and food technologies because of their requirement. How that can be transmitted for civilian consumption would be something that is extremely important. The third point associated here is in terms of exports. Prime Minister's call again for district level export hub is something that CIM has already mentioned in the new trade policy. If we have to do that, in what direction we go and how do we bring that in our focus. At the national level, if you see how do we classify our export or import basket. At my institute, what we have done is to further improvise trade classification for high technology, medium technology, and low technology goods. If you look at the first such classification which came out in terms of how we bring in this kind of classification was by Pevitt in 1984. OECD further improvised on this classification in 1996, and Sanjay Lal did further improvement in 2000. We have turned SITC at 3-digit level, which Sanjay Lal did, to 6-digit harmonized system of trade classification. And based on that, we have calculated how in last 9 years, India's export of high technology goods has gone up, and how our imports of high technology goods has come down. If you see the high technology exports in 2012 and 2013, which was at 8.3 in 2013, 2018, the high technology export has gone up to 9.1%, and in 2022, for which the latest data is available, we stand at 10.4%. This is the export. And import, if you see, we have come down in terms of identifying the priority. From 9.2%, our import has gone down to 5% and then further below. So the point is, and this is also a period when global trade has gone more in direction of the parts and components as predominant. Now I have, 2 minutes more. So, so this is something which is important in terms of our trade basket. The G20 declaration has also given enough emphasis in terms of how states can can capture and take that forward. Two important points here. One is in terms of how the startup ecosystem is working. The fact that all 643 districts now have at least one startup, the figure that Economic Survey brought out, with all 30 states participating in startup policy, we need to create ecosystem. Quite a few states have come up with their own ideas of startup mechanisms and financing mechanisms. I think it is important. NITI Aayog would have to be congratulated for thinking of the India Innovation Index and 5 dimensions that this index emphasizes. State governments would have to think in terms of how do we bring in more parameters related to human capital, on investment, on knowledge workers, business involvement, safety and legal involvement. And that, I think, brings in the dimension that is important. Last but not the least is in terms of how do we create a cohesion. Those in economics who have followed national innovation system, or as Mr. Sinha referred to Bangalore, which is more regional innovation system, we need to see in what direction regional innovation system or even city level innovation system, which is now so evident in Bangalore, Pune and Hyderabad. How do we bring that to our states where, particularly in the belt where STI hasn't gone that much traction, that I think would be extremely important. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chaturvedi. Now I will request Dr. Nilaya Verma.
I wish I was a doctor, but I'm still working on that. You know, I want to make a start by saying how struck I was looking at the panel, which consists of people from scientific research, from policy research, and from academia, because very often conversation on innovation, especially at state, tends to mean startup. And I always say startups are more innovative, but that's not innovation. And I think that's extremely important to understand. I really wanted to make 5 points of learnings, but before I come to those 5 points of learning, just 4 data points to highlight why I'm going to suggest some of the things that I'm suggesting. There's a study which says that half of the per capita difference between India and US is not explained by capital investment, but by the capacity and the innovation capacity of the people in those countries. And I think that's really what innovation does in terms of driving economic growth. In last year, there was a study done which essentially said that the top 3 priorities of most companies in the world, one of them was innovation. And yet, when the results were seen of innovation, only 10% of those companies had actually done something about it. And the reason for that difference was culture. Because innovation is not just about policy, it's about a culture that organizations have to do, and that's extremely important for a country as well. Third, you know, again from last year, about 183 companies which were studied who have very strong innovation practices, they actually demonstrated 2.5 times more economic value than in those companies otherwise. And finally, the data point, and it's extremely important in the context of the states as well, is 50% of the workforce in Silicon Valley does not come from US. That's extremely important for the purpose of innovation of the countries, and especially for states, especially smaller states. Before I quickly come to this, to the 5 points, I mean, we all know the last 10 years, India has demonstrated innovation, especially in technology, in digital at scale. We all talk about Aadhaar, 71 billion more transactions. UPI in October itself, we had about what? About 11 billion transactions on UPI and over 200 billion value transacted. Within Karnataka, I know Archana from ITBT department is here. She's going to be talking about Karnataka because Karnataka NITI Aayog report for the last 3 years has spoken about Karnataka as being #1. Clearly, there 40% of unicorns are there. 42% of India's software exports come from Karnataka. And I know she's going to talk a lot in detail, but 4th thing that struck me, #1 is the diversity of the workforce in the state of Karnataka. And I think that's something that we need to understand and appreciate because that's what's driving that culture. Second is the number of events, conferences happens in Karnataka for exchange of ideas, which is again very, very critical for the purpose of innovation ecosystem to exist. Third is the ecosystem. I mean, we talk about academia. There are a large number of defense PSUs in the state of Karnataka, and the extent of innovations that driving, for example, within the DRDO network, ADA, I've personally worked with them, the kind of innovations and the kind of companies that they're working in and promoting innovation. So it's not just about a startup or single, it's just the ecosystem is very important. And the fourth, for me, from Karnataka was institutionalization of the innovative or the innovation ecosystem within the government, which is not just vertical but horizontal, and I'm sure she's going to talk about it. But then let me come back to the 5 points that I wanted to talk about from a learnings perspective. I think the first, and something that we should talk about, India today has very large number of scientific, academic, technical education institutions. And I go back to a project that I worked in Maharashtra about 12, 13 years back. That's the time when e-governance was coming into the country. And I still remember the gentleman is the secretary to the government of India right now. He says, look, when I go as the IT department to a line department and say, digitize kar do, they just ask me a question. He says, now what I've changed is, I've changed the ACR wherein every departmental head or the secretary has to deliver 2 e-governance services, so they come to us. Now, the reality is we have such large numbers of institutions, government-funded institutions. Why can't we bring them together with industry and drive outcomes for innovation working with them? That's part of the KRA. That's one thing that I want to talk about. Second is really about, and people have spoken about this before, is about education, but in particular STEM education. And I want to give an example of Andhra Pradesh, which is currently doing. To inculcate higher order and original thinking skills, they've actually got together Google, Intel, NASCOM, AWS, and many other agencies, and they're introducing the new technologies from classes 8 to 12 as part of this to be able to drive that. And I think that is a long-term bedrock on how innovation will happen in the state. In fact, they've done very interesting things. They've actually brought in practitioner to speak about, to teach, not teachers, because it also reduces the cost. So they've done that. Third is many states today have funds for startups, etc. I do believe there are 2 things that we can learn from. One, when we are funding, especially government is more happy giving grants because of the way accounting is done. But I do believe we need to find, and Dr. Virmani talked about that, we need to find better instruments so that we can reinvest when companies succeed, but also put more money towards IPR creation as opposed to simply innovation or which may be broader in nature. Fourth point that I want to talk about is really about mission-oriented projects. Every state cannot be doing everything else. Now, every state has specific, areas, industries, and therefore, when you're talking about innovation, when you're talking about the innovation policy, the last thing you need to do is cut, copy, paste from what other states are doing, but essentially look at what are the industries, what are the sectors, what is my capacity to promote, and therefore, for example, Telangana recently started with, sandbox for Web3 technology so that they can drive innovation in Web3. Somebody else may be good at textiles. So rather than simply looking at innovation at state at a broader level, look at the industry and the capacity. Finally, my fifth point, and this is something that everybody's talked about, there is so much evidence. Clearly, you have to incentivize R&D. I mean, that is one of the fundamental ways to drive innovation. So these are my 5 points. Let me just end it quickly, and I'm going to be in time by making 3 points. Number one, innovation requires ideas, and ideas need to be protected through IPR. It is critical. Number two, it's the ecosystem that's drive innovation, not one component or the other. And the third is you get what you incentivize. And therefore, when you're looking at policies, be clear what is the policy outcome that you want for those policies, especially at states to succeed. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nilaya. Now I'll request Sanjeev Bikhchandani to give his views.
Thank you, sir. I'll try and be brief. So, I'm a Sindhi. I don't have a state in India, so I don't have Pramath Sinha's problem, right? Where my home state is or is not doing what the center is doing, right? But look, if I am now 60 years old, I began my working career in 1984, right, in the private sector, in an advertising agency. If I look back to 1984, and I compare it to the Indian economy, Indian industry today, there's been a complete change. Now, it's not been a revolution, it's been an evolution. Right? Bit by bit, year by year, quarter by quarter, decade by decade, things have changed. Right? But if you look at where the growth, the innovation, the investment, the buzz, the employment increase has come from, it has come from companies and sectors and industries that did not exist or barely existed 40 years ago. So the IT services industry barely existed. IT-enabled services did not exist. Mobile telephony did not exist. The internet did not exist. Private sector insurance did not exist. Private sector banking barely existed. Private sector airlines did not exist. Organized retail did not exist. E-commerce did not exist. Mobile apps did not exist. The internet did not exist. So all of this is essentially innovation. Right? Some of it may be IP. Some of it may not be IP. Some of it may be just better execution or different execution of existing business models. But it is still innovation. Right? But if you look at what drove this innovation over the last 40 years, right? I think the first thing was India has a large market. Because India has a large market, 1.4 billion population, at that time it was 500 million or 600 million, I forget now. You had a large enough market for your product, and therefore you were incentivized to improve, innovate, and do stuff. Right? The second is talent. We had the talent to do this, and that comes back to your STEM education, or it comes back to the kind of education systems we've got, and the government has invested in since the 1950s. It comes from enterprise. India has always been entrepreneurial. Even through the license permit Raj days, it was entrepreneurial. It's got a huge cadre of entrepreneurs, and now we are seeing with deregulation, with the new economic policy since 1991, how many more entrepreneurs we've got as compared to earlier. Right? It requires capital. Now, India has had capital scarcity from the beginning, and particularly risk capital is very scarce. Capital that will back new enterprises, and not debt, but equity. And there we are dependent largely on overseas capital. But I think the government has taken some good steps on the fund of funds to actually kickstart the domestic venture capital industry. Right? But most importantly, it has to do with regulation. When the government deregulated, it allowed private enterprise to enter sectors where it was prohibited from earlier. So these are 6 drivers of in growth, innovation, whatever you want to call it: talent, regulation, capital, technology, markets, market size, and enterprise. Right? And any government, state or center, I think would do well to focus on these 6 and to see where it can enable more innovation by enabling some of these factors to actually blossom. So if I look at what's happened in recent years, I think the government has played a very important role. Number 1, in the area of regulation and deregulation. Number 2 is the government has laid the foundation for very many types of innovation. So if you look at mobile telephony, you look at the internet, you look at the UPI, you look at now the health stack. These are all, the digital public infrastructure has all been done by the government. On the back of this, you had a whole bunch of innovation taking place. So the government has innovated there, and on top of that, private sector has innovated. Right? So the role of the government is to keep on, I think, investing in digital public infrastructure, at the same time having sensible and smart regulation, so that private enterprise can come in and build on top of this. Now, very often what happens with regulation is that technology moves ahead of regulation. पहले technology आती है, regulation is still lagging behind, बाद में फिर regulate होता है. And sometimes there's a clash. I'll give you an example. 1991, we had the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. That was the first time, we got cable TV into our homes, where it was a television war, and you had CNN coming in and on dish antennas, and then you had mushrooming of dish antennas all over India, particular cities, and suddenly you had cable TV in people's homes when the regulation did not cover it. Regulation only allowed for one TV channel, and that was Doordarshan. It was only several years later that the government regulated and came out with things. Now, when technology moves fast, the government needs to catch up with sensible regulation. And what we are seeing in the recent years is the government is doing that, but very often it is chasing technology. Whether you look at crypto, whether you look at blockchain, whether you look at data privacy, government is catching up. I think it's important that the regulations are sensible and they do not impede innovation and enterprise. It is important that at the last mile, inspectors and they don't come in the way. You got to do the right thing, but at the same time, you must not discourage innovation. I'll stop here, sir. But these are the 5 or 6 points I wanted to make about what will drive innovation and therefore what kind of policies and regulations you need to have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bikhchandani.
So now it's my pleasant duty to summarize what was said in this panel discussion. So the panel started with Dr. Virmani. He gave the importance or the differences between commercial and strategic technologies, the role of government and the role of private sector in driving innovation. He also talked about the dimensions of innovation, the stages of risk, and how to take a technology from the lab to the market. He also gave some policy ideas to promote innovation. Then we had a talk by Pramath Sinha from Ashoka University. He gave 2 examples, from Malaysia as well as Andhra Pradesh. The Malaysian example was how to convert from a manufacturing economy to the knowledge economy, and he shared his experiences based on his role there. He also talked about
how Andhra Pradesh, during the regime of Dr. Chandrababu Naidu as Chief Minister, brought in the IT revolution to Hyderabad, and how the region of Gachibowli has become a knowledge hub in the state of now Telangana. Then we had Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi giving the example of innovation in Madhya Pradesh. He brought out the importance of having capacity, that is human capacity, how the states have to connect with the central schemes, how exports are essential to drive the innovation ecosystem. He also mentioned the importance of having a startup ecosystem. He gave the example of Bangalore and Hyderabad. Then we had a talk by Dr. Nilaya Verma. He brought out 5 important points necessary for innovation. He talked about the culture which is essential to drive innovation. He also brought about the need for having diversity in the workforce and the importance of having mechanisms for exchange of ideas. He also again mentioned the presence of an ecosystem as well as the importance of IPR creation. He mentioned that it is important that each state finds a particular mission rather than each state trying to do everything by itself. It should identify a niche area on which it can focus on. And he also mentioned that it is important to incentivize R&D to promote innovation. Finally, we had Sanjeev Bikhchandani, who talked about importance of the markets. He said that innovations are driven by markets. He also brought about the need for talent. He highlighted the importance of capital, especially risk capital, for driving innovation. And then he mentioned that government has to play a key role in regulation, but it is also important that governments keep up with the technological changes and the importance of having regulations in place when the technology is in the nascent stage is very important to promote innovation. So all in all, I think the panelists express views which states can learn on how to promote innovation in their own states. If we have some time, I think the panelists will be glad to answer a few questions.
Yes, sir. We'll request that if the chair and the co-chair may kindly agree, we can request the audience to ask questions, especially those from the states and the union territories.
Yes, definitely.
Just as a member spoke about the problems of the our startup and industry.
Please identify yourself.
I am Dr. Anand Mishra, Director Planning, Government of UP.
Okay.
So you can start as a Udyamita Nidhi, entrepreneur. Nidhi is a जैसे सम्मान निधि किसान के लिए बनी, वैसे उद्यमता निधि you just can promote for the उद्यम where the debt and the crisis is involved. You can just push the money for their debt and crisis. Another, you should also develop at the NITI Aayog venture capital for the innovations, so that just to promote, just you have started state support missions, so you can start with the innovations to promote more and more. Thank you.
It's more a comment than a question. Anybody else? Yeah. Please identify yourself before asking.
Warm good evening. We are very fortunate to listen to this panel discussion. My name is Priyesh Mishra, sir. I work for the Atal Innovation Mission team under Dr. Chintan Vaishnav. My question is to Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi and to you, sir. Also, what in your experience and your foresightedness is the single biggest catalyst required in India to promote innovation in the next 10 years? I mean, in the order of priority, I would say the single biggest catalyst that can be there to promote innovation throughout the country in the ecosystem.
I think my personal view is it's the risk capital. If we provide capital at the right time to our innovators, I think that will result in a significant improvement in our innovation ecosystem.
Thank you. No, I think Dr. Kamat is absolutely right. This is where we require our attention and making that available. The suggestion that has just now come up in terms of Udyamita Nidhi, I think is an important dimension. But to me, as I was mentioning, all states are not at the same stage of economic development. Our states are at different level. This heterogeneity requires a very nuanced approach on innovation, and that's where capital appetite would be. The idea of our ministry, DPIIT, in terms of creating, for instance, medical devices clusters all across. Now, medical devices clusters would require a particular kind of human resources. They would require capital impetus in terms of how associated industries are coming in, how associated hospitals are coming in, what kind of demand they would create. So this whole ecosystem that is required around a production unit where you are going to put in capital. Like for instance, if you see India's largest import is what? Petroleum, the oil that we are consuming. Do we have ships to bring them? We hire ships. During COVID crisis, we have seen how it became a geopolitical issue. So the geopolitics require India to pump in capital into areas where we can secure our future. Dr. Virmani in his initial keynote address mentioned about a strategic technology board or some kind of setup, which Dr. Kamakoti has been talking about. So we need to secure our future. China's effort to weaponize monsoon is not something that the Earth Sciences Ministry is not aware of. So we need to pull in capital into areas where we can protect our future. China also blocked us to get the APIs. We could not get that. So shipbuilding industry, monsoon predictions, weather forecasting abilities, and a protection of them, our coast and coastlines related, our imports, they all require huge. So that's where defense and industrial complex comes in, where a huge pumping in of capital would be required. And that is largely associated with what Dr. Kamat in one line said in terms of risk.
I would also like to add that our education system has to be improved to get better human resources. Our education system is too much dependent on learning by memory. It doesn't teach people to question, to innovate at a young age.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, I'm tempted to ask a question. I'm Neeraj Sinha from the NITI Aayog. This is to Mr. Sanjeev Bikhchandani. I was just curious to know what drove you to create, to the best of my limited knowledge, not one, not two, but 3 unicorns.
So we didn't set out to create unicorns. We just set out to solve problems. A unicorn ban gayi over 10 years, 15 years, that's a different matter. We were just trying to solve an unsolved problem.
So you can't start with thinking that you will make a unicorn. I think you have to start small. It'll grow if things are right.
And I believe you, policybazaar.com and jeevansathi.com, which you mentioned, were areas you thought were gap areas where you could move in. So there were gaps in the society which you were able to identify and tap. Thank you so much.
He said that it is driven by the markets. Yeah. So he identified the right problems which the market needed.
Sir, I would like to, I'm more at ease speaking in Hindi.
Please, you can speak in Hindi, but please identify yourself.
Myself, Tim Prakash, Additional Director, Department of Planning and Development, Government of Bihar.
हिंदी में बोलिए.
सर कुछ अर्थव्यवस्थाएं अपने विकास की उस स्थिति में हैं जो बहुत विकसित नहीं है और विकास की तरफ अग्रसर हैं. उनकी सामाजिक परिस्थितियां कुछ इस तरह की हैं कि वहाँ के लोग बाढ़ और सुखाड़ से हर वर्ष पीड़ित होते हैं. कुछ परिस्थितियां ऐसी हैं कि बहुत सारे भूमि से संबंधित मुकदमे उनके आसपास हैं. कई मामलों में सिक्योरिटी इश्यूज बहुत सारे हैं. हमारे देश में 4 करोड़ से अधिक बहुत पुराने केसेज सुप्रीम कोर्ट में पेंडिंग हैं. हमने राइट टू पब्लिक सर्विस एक्ट, राइट टू पब्लिक ग्रीवांस रिडक्शन एक्ट ऐसे एक्ट्स बनाए हैं. ये हमारे व्यवस्था की बुनियादी ज़रूरतें आज की परिस्थितियों में हैं. हम ये इनोवेशन से जब हम अपनी बुनियादी परिस्थितियां ठीक कर सकते हैं तो लोगों का ध्यान ODOP पे जा सकता है, लोगों का ध्यान इनोवेशन पे जा सकता है. एक बात ये सर, तो हमारे इनोवेशंस की प्राथमिक आवश्यकता ये है कि लोगों की बुनियादी आवश्यकताओं को, उनकी समस्याओं को इनोवेटिव आइडियाज से दूर करें और फिर उनको इकोनॉमिक डेवलपमेंट की तरफ इंस्पायर करें. एक सर, दूसरा है कि हमारा सिस्टम आज़ादी के बाद जिस तरह का बना, एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव सेक्टर हो, हमारी व्यवस्थाएं ऐसी हों, और आज सर ज़रूरत यह है कि हमारी इस व्यवस्था में एक छोटा सा देश का कोई भी नागरिक अगर कोई बढ़िया सुझाव देता है तो उसको प्रोत्साहित करने का जो सिस्टम होना चाहिए वो सिस्टम इंस्टीट्यूशनलाइज होना चाहिए. अगर ऐसा सिस्टम बनता है तो हर आदमी देश का अपने आप को इस देश का एक सम्मानित नागरिक समझेगा और किसी भी स्तर पे, किसी भी विषय पे, किसी भी प्रक्षेत्र में वो अपनी सुझावों को सामने रख सकेगा और उसका एक्सेप्टेंस नेशनल लेवल से लेके पंचायत स्तर तक होना चाहिए। हमारे जितने डाटा सिस्टम हैं, हमारी जितनी एक्टिविटीज हैं सर, तो उन सभी का सबसे अच्छा उपयोग तब हो सकता है जब हम अपने अपने क्षेत्रों में, प्रक्षेत्रों में, गांव हो, शहर हो, हमारे सुझावों को सही ढंग से एक्सेप्ट किया जाए और अपने पॉलिसीज में उसको शामिल किया जाए। थैंक यू सर।
हाँ, आपके दोनों सुझाव अच्छे हैं और आई थिंक नीति आयोग देखेगी ये कैसे इम्प्लीमेंट किया जा सकता। थैंक यू। प्लीज।
Hello. Namaskar, sir. I am from Andaman Nicobar, Union Territory of Andaman Nicobar, and belonging to the academia background. So what sort of academic intervention, as you said, the reforms are required in the academic system for improving the innovation ecosystem. So what sort of academic intervention you foresee that could be presented to the government, sir, for improving the credits, the students who are more towards this entrepreneurship aptitude, they should be probably exempted some credit from the academic thing so that they can get credit from their entrepreneurial aptitude. Some sort of reforms you foresee in the academic background, sir?
Yeah, I think the Atal Tinkering Labs, which the central government has proposed, I think that should be implemented in each and every school.
So particularly in the higher education arena, so I'm from higher education.
Okay, you're from higher education.
Yeah.
Very good, yeah, very good. So you would like to say?
My understanding, I'm not the expert here, is that the new education policy of the government of India has got a whole bunch of reforms that are being implemented already. I'm also on the board of Ashoka University, so I know a little bit about it. And I think that's a big move forward.
Right, sir. Thank you, sir.
Good evening to all. Sir, myself.
Last question.
Yes, sir. Myself, Nehru, coming from Andaman Nicobar Islands, from School Development Authority. Sir, in your speech you said the educational system should be improved. What are the key points you expected to implement to improve the educational system?
So as I said, we have to undergo, see now information is easily available. See earlier information was not available. We were teaching students about things which now they can easily search for. What you have to now teach them is how they can go about doing innovative things. So this is a teaching which has to come in the curriculum. We have to provide them more laboratories where they can experiment. If they have some thoughts, they should be able to experiment and see if what they are thinking can be implemented actually. So these are some changes which have to happen gradually. For that, we also have to improve the quality of teachers.
By providing trainings, frequent training to the teachers.
Correct.
Yes. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So I think, would you like to have the last word?
No, I think it's been a good discussion. I think Mr. Bikhchandani should have given a little more of his personal experiences. I think those are the most telling, but you were very, yeah, you were too brief with your words, but otherwise it was good. Thank you everybody, thank the participants and thank all the people who are here listening.
Thank you, sir. Before we disperse, we would like to present a small gesture of gratitude. I would like to invite Dr. Sinha to felicitate our guests.
We are calling them Earth Sciences. Earth Sciences. We will take, हमले जाएंगे.